Next Monday, this special school near Southend was meant to be reopening its doors after the summer break. But now the only people allowed in are building surveyors. Parents were told yesterday that the school was one of the 104 that had been identified as containing potentially dangerous aerated concrete, known as RAC, so would remain shut to students for at least a week. One of those students is Melanie's daughter, Jessica.
Having a special needs child, you know, she has severe autism, so she needs her routine, she needs her regularity, she needs her continuity, something I cannot give, you know, 110% of the time, you know, and the school does a fantastic job at helping them, and it's just completely going to throw her out of her routine. And I understand there's safety concerns, I understand there's safety issues, but at the end of the day, again, they're letting the children down.
It's going to be very disruptive, and especially because of the complex nature of the needs in this school, it's not possible just to say we'll use another building or use another school. That option just isn't available, so it's going to have to be on-site delivery, and obviously there's the question of equipment and the stuff that the children and pupils need to function every day at school. And unfortunately that is in the main building that's not able to be entered at the moment, so we are looking obviously to look at alternatives.
The rapid halt to the new term at over 100 schools in England comes after a number of incidents, including a beam collapsing in a school over the summer that showed no prior signs of damage.
What emerged over the summer was a number of cases in schools and in England and outside England and in commercial buildings where RAC that was considered to be safe actually turned out not to be safe. So over the summer we looked at that evidence, we challenged the experts, and we had to take the very difficult decision that in the schools that had RAC identified, even though it wasn't in a critical condition, we needed to take those buildings or rooms out of action, and that's what changed in the summer. And we're supporting schools with a caseworker for each school so that they can find alternative accommodation or put in measures to prop up or make the school safe.
But this isn't the first time this has happened. In 2018, a school staff room with RAC collapsed one weekend with little warning. And we've spoken with a headmaster at St Andrew's Primary School near Bolton, who said part of his school collapsed because of RAC in 2017. 6 years later, and just a month before the most recent collapse in a school, the Department for Education published their annual report. In it, they say at the time of publication, there are no open schools or college buildings where we know of an imminent risk of harm.
Well, I would like to be absolutely clear to the noble lady and to the House that the department is not aware of any child or member of staff being in a school which poses an imminent safety risk.
No one can give a direct timescale of how long it might take to fix the issues in schools, but to give you an idea, this school in Essex has been dealing with concrete since the May half term. Parents were told that the school would reopen as normal in a few days' time, but last week they were advised it's now likely to be mid-November until the new temporary classrooms arrive.
Simon Harris has 3 children at the school who are now being taught at 3 different schools while they wait for theirs to reopen.
The school have done absolutely everything in their power to work, just to get things sorted out, to make sure there's very, very little disruption to the kids' education. Again, I think they're just working with one hand tied behind their back when it comes to the DfE's lack of action.
And it's not just England. It's been identified in 35 schools in Scotland and more than 250 of NHS Scotland sites. There's now an urgent review of all institutions in Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland, as governments across the UK change tack to try and prevent a potential disaster.
So a big problem now faces the government. But were there earlier opportunities to get on top of it? We know that RAC has been on the government's radar since at least 2002, when the Building Research Establishment, that was the UK government's building safety lab, raised concerns following tests. Skip forward to July 2018, and those concerns got very real indeed, when the roof of a classroom in Kent collapsed Fortunately, there were no pupils there at the time. In December 2018, the Department for Education said they made building owners aware of recent component failures. Then, in 2020, a safety alert was issued by an independent building safety reporting service. They'd learned of 2 more incidents involving RAC, including an even earlier classroom collapse at a school in Bolton, which we heard about in Anya's report there. But it wasn't until March 2022 that the Department for Education sent out a survey to councils in England asking them to find out which schools contained RAC. That's 4 years after the collapse in Kent. Today, the Schools Minister Nick Gibb admitted that even now, not all schools have responded. In July this year, as we've heard, the Department for Education published their annual report. It stated at the time of publication there are no open schools or college buildings where we know of an imminent risk of harm. But just a month after that statement was made, a beam collapsed in a school, we've not been told where, prompting the emergency closures that were announced yesterday, just days before the school term started. Now, we did ask the government for our own interview with us tonight, but no one was available. We also asked the Scottish and Welsh governments as well, but no one from Edinburgh or Cardiff was able to come on the programme to discuss this issue either. The Department for Education did send us this statement in the last hour that the decision to close or partially close schools was made out of an abundance of caution, they say, and that more than 90% of schools have now responded to their RAC survey. As to why it took 4 years to send out that survey following the collapse of a classroom ceiling in Kent, they pointed out that they, in collaboration with the Local Government Association, released a warning shortly after that incident, encouraging schools to report issues with RAC. Krish.
Thanks, Kieran. Well, earlier I spoke to Kaz Evans, the head teacher of Parks Primary School in Leicester. She had to close and relocate a large part of the school earlier in the year because the aerated concrete had been discovered there. And I began by asking her what had happened at her school.
In June, we were told that we had RAC across the whole of our school, and it was in a critical condition, which meant that we had to close a large proportion of our school, leaving only open the reception class and 2 Year 1 classes and 2 Year 2 classes.
And can you tell me what happened in the build-up to that? How was the RAC discovered at your school?
The school was surveyed, I think, going back now into January, if not just before, into 2022. And as was requested by the government, that all schools in the country get a survey. So we got a survey which told you whether you had RAC or not. And then the situation was how bad was the RAC? So in January, we didn't know, but I think the local authority knew that we had RAC, and then they came in then to do an intrusive survey in the end of May in order to assess what condition the RAC was in, because the situation at that point was that if the RAC is there but in a good condition, then the school can stay open because it's considered safe. However, that wasn't the situation for us because they did the survey on the RAC and the RAC wasn't in a good situation. So that's why you got the immediate closure.
From your experience then, your school was told it was unsafe and you were moved out back in June. It's only now that the government is putting out this new guidance to schools all over the country. Does that tally up to you, given what happened to you and what they're now saying today?
I'm completely baffled, and the only thing I can think of is that something must have happened which says that there's been a ceiling collapse in the last couple of weeks where they had considered that RAC to be safe, but actually that RAC isn't safe, because the issue with RAC when it collapses that you don't get any warning. So what they do is they usually check the quality of the RAC, and if the RAC is of good quality, although they know it needs to be removed, they didn't see that as urgent. So the only thing I can think of why this urgent information has come out just yesterday, and there's been a complete change in guidance for those schools that have actually had that RAC identified without yet it being surveyed, is because they know of an incident. But other than that, I don't know why it's taken so long to get to where we have got to today, and why it's so close to children going back.
And just finally, I mean, as somebody who's had to do it, any advice to schools about how you maintain stability when you've got such a sort of a dramatic shift in premises and circumstances?
I'm not going to lie, it's been the hardest thing. I've had for 25 years, it's the hardest thing I've ever been through. What I will say is there is light at the end of the tunnel for us. So it is hard. It's hard to find accommodation. It's hard to do the move. But know that once you get the children settled, children are very resilient. Our parents have been, our community have been resilient. We were worried about how they would be. They've been brilliant. And I think that would be the same. People would understand the situation.
Kaz Evans, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, Warren Thomas is a concrete expert at Henderson Thomas Associates, and he joins me now. And you've actually been checking schools.
I have actually
even in the
today.
last couple of days.
Even today, yes.
But you've not found any that are.
Luckily, I haven't found anything so far in London.
Now, you've brought some of this rack concrete in with you. Could you explain what's wrong with it?
Well, the variation from what we would call conventional reinforced concrete, rack concrete, as you can see, has no aggregate, so it's a lot weaker. And the main concern is we have a hidden defect here. Here you can see quite clearly where a reinforcing bar was adjacent to this area. This can corrode with no outward signs. You'd normally get a crack in conventional concrete, would give us an idea of what's going on. Here, you don't get anything.
So you'd never tell?
So you never tell. What you have to do, you'd have to undertake non-destructive testing, which we could determine this. But that's the second stage. The first stage is what I believe has happened in the schools so far, is they've identified rack concrete, but they then need to go on and determine the condition of the rack concrete before you close or open the schools. And I don't know if that's what they've done. The government hasn't really given out any information.
How long have you known that rack concrete was a problem like this?
I believe first publications where there could be concerns was in '96, but following the collapse of the school in Kent in 2018, the Cross Department, which is the collaborative reporting of safer structures, produced a guidance note, and very shortly after that, the Institute of Structural Engineers. So 2019, we knew there were problems, and because of that collapse, we should have been checking straight away from then what was going on with the schools and other structures that may have rack concrete in there as well.
So what do you make of this sort of, apparent sort of sudden panic?
I don't know if the government has kept information to themselves and made a decision, because I can't see why, the lack of information that's coming from. Have they actually ascertained the condition of all the schools that have rack concrete in there? First question, I don't know. You can safely manage rack, given the right expertise and experience. You don't have to.
So had it been done gradually, there wouldn't have been any need to suddenly close scores of schools.
I think we're trying to catch up because of 4 or 5 years of really not doing very much. I mean, I was listening to some other news, and I believe 15,000 schools were built between the 30s and the 90s. I don't believe 50% of them have been tested. And
what other kinds of buildings could be using this stuff? Is it any kind of building? I mean, could it be in this building? I mean,
it's mainly buildings that would have been built by the government. So anything like the old PSA.
Why? Because it was cheap? Or...
Well, no, not necessarily. It was just these. It was after the war. It was quite a cheap product to use, lightweight, so it could be built very easily. So it was predominantly schools, hospitals, courts, police stations, job centres, and other government organisations.
Housing?
I haven't seen it in housing. I've seen it in a residential house in Wales.
What do you mean by that?
It was a house that had been built. It was a large house that had been converted into multiple occupancy. And when they came, someone bought it to do it up, big house. And this is where these samples come from. And he had no idea what was going on. And we got called in after being on one of the news shows. And yeah, I can't...
So this is much bigger than schools, basically?
It could be in a number of other buildings, and we don't have a robust investigation or maintenance of buildings. We do on bridges and other assets in the country, buildings. The Grenfell Tower is a classic example. We don't really look after our buildings.
Warren Thomas, thank you very much indeed.
My pleasure.
Well, earlier I spoke to the Shadow Education Secretary, Bridget Phillipson, and I asked her what she thinks should happen now.
Well, we need the government to be absolutely clear about the extent of the schools that are affected by this. We haven't seen a full list published of all of the schools affected. I think ministers should come clean, and parents have got a right to know. But then there's been the suggestion today from the Schools Minister, Nick Gibb, that actually there might be more schools. So we can't even be completely confident that we understand the full extent of the challenge that we're seeing at the moment. And keeping children safe in school has to be the #1 priority.
This is not a new thing. I mean, we first covered it months ago in February, and it goes back years. Do you understand why the apparent panic just before the start of term?
This has been a known issue for years, and in the time that I've been Shadow Education Secretary, I've been raising this time and time again with ministers, because it's clear that whether it's with RAC, this special kind of crumbly concrete, or just the general condition of our schools estate, these last 13 years have meant that we've ended up in a position where lots of our schools are just not fit for purpose.
Well, whose fault is it within the government?
Well, I think you do have to question Nick Gibb on that. Nick Gibb was the Schools Minister in 2010 when the incoming Conservative government took the decision to cancel the Building Schools for the Future programme, Labour's school rebuilding programme. They completely failed to put in place any national plan for what came after it. And then here we are today, Nick Gibb on the television talking about major problems across our schools estate. The chickens are coming home to roost after 13 years of Conservative negligence where it comes to our children's education.
Right, but government's going to have to pay for all the building work that needs to be done in these, what could be hundreds of schools. Then there's going to be all sorts of other public sector buildings that might also need to be rebuilt. This could turn into a massive bill, couldn't it?
The trouble is, this is all just yet more sticking plaster. It's pouring good money after bad because we've not had a long-term plan for dealing with many known risks and for rebuilding our schools. We've ended up in a position where the government will have to spend considerable sums of money, a figure yet to be determined, on a sticking plaster, when actually what we need is a long-term plan for rebuilding and refurbishing the schools estate.
Yeah, but here you are and you want to be the Education Secretary next year and you don't have a long-term plan either because you're worried about committing money.
Well, I don't know the full extent of what we're facing, and I don't think we even know the full extent of the challenge around crumbly concrete, let alone the wider challenges that we're facing in the schools estate. So I'd want to take stock of exactly what's going on. I would want to understand the full extent of the challenge that we face. But as we did in 1997, we will once again put Britain on a better path. We will put education right at the heart of the vision that we want for our country.
These are great words, but where's the substance? And, you know, that's why people do say about, you know, this basic dilemma of what's the point of voting Labour if you're not prepared to actually say how things will be different? It's not good enough to just say we'll be more competent.
Well, I think it will be a good starting point, but no, I accept that. And that's why, you know, I've said that we'll end the tax breaks that private schools enjoy, and we put that money into thousands more teachers in our classrooms. I'll make sure that we have breakfast clubs for every primary school child in England. I'll drive up standards across our country. I'll reform Ofsted. I'll deliver more apprenticeships. I'll make sure that young people, whatever their background, have every opportunity to get on in life.
Bridget Phillipson, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, as we've said, the problem of RAC concrete goes wider than school buildings. It features across the NHS estate as well. So earlier, I spoke to Sir Julian Hartley, who's the Chief Executive of NHS Providers. And I began by asking him about the current situation with NHS hospitals.
Well, reinforced aerated concrete has been used in hospitals, and obviously there's an estate's risk around reinforced concrete. We know that it's got a lifespan of around 30 years, but some trusts have used these materials for over 50 years. So in terms of the scale of this across the NHS, there are 7 hospitals that are at the most critical risk, and all of those are in the new hospitals programme and obviously due for replacement by 2030. We'd like to see that move more quickly, but in the meantime, money is being spent to mitigate the risk by using things like steel struts and scaffolding to ensure it mitigates, minimises the risk of collapse. And the use of monitoring and propping is the approach that hospitals are taking while the new hospitals are built. But those 7 constitute the highest risk, but there are around 16 trusts that have facilities that are built of this aerated concrete, and there is a plan to eliminate aerated concrete from the NHS altogether by 2035.
And are you sure you know the extent of the problem?
Those 16 trusts and 34 buildings associated with those trusts, that was the estimate put in an answer to a parliamentary question back in July of last year.
So it could be wrong.
So that's the latest data we've got in terms of the scope of this.
Well, I mean, give me your feeling. I mean, do you think we are running higher risk than we should be?
We've seen a significant increase in backlog maintenance that is in the high and significant risk category, and also the fact that the cost to eliminate backlog maintenance across the NHS has gone up to around 10 billion, which is double what it was 10 years ago. So, of course, we've elevated the level of risk in terms of reliability, leaky roofs, burst pipes, and so on. So it isn't satisfactory right now. Absolutely, we do need to see greater investment in the capital estate across the service. The government have prioritised, obviously, the new hospitals programme, the 40 new hospitals, and the 7 hospitals built of reinforced concrete, but there is much more to do.
And given how long this has been going on and been known about within the health sector, are you surprised when you see the sudden closure of schools a couple of days before the start of term?
Well, I can't speak for the education sector.
No, of course not. I just mean, but you've known about this.
But if you compare schools with hospitals, schools are smaller. Obviously, they don't have full-time estates teams in the way that hospitals do. So there are differences between the two. But I mean, this clearly, reinforced autoclaved aerated concrete has been widely used across public sector buildings. These problems have been with us for some time. We obviously, in the NHS, have recognised that and are trying to address that, perhaps not as fast as we need to, but certainly understanding that there's a plan to do that, and mitigating the risks in the meantime is crucial.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.